This is El Salvador, located in Central America, the most dangerous country in the world. So dangerous that only 6 to 9 years ago it was called the murder capital of the world, because between 2014 and 2017, an average of 16 to 20 people were killed every day. The conditions here were so bad that around 20,000 pilgrims were killed in gang wars, and 20% of the population had to leave the country. But in the last 4 years, this most dangerous country has now come to the list of the safest countries in the world. The crime rate is now even lower than in the US. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, but geopolitically it is very important because of its location. El Salvador is south of Mexico, between Guatemala and Honduras, and then the Pacific Ocean. Due to its coastline with El Salvador, it also has access to the Panama Canal, which means that if the government is destabilized, the gangsters here can also damage the Panama Canal, one of the largest in the world, is a trade choke point, and that's why the US has always had a lot of interest in El Salvador. The relationship between the two countries is so close. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, El Salvador was the only Latin American country to join US coalition forces. In addition, all airports in El Salvador can be used by the US military at any time, and most of the US military uses this airport for counter-narcotics missions. If you go to El Salvador today, seeing the beauty and peace there, you won't be able to imagine that a few years ago this country was suffering from the worst violence. And that violence is tied to the history of El Salvador, as well as to something that many of us drink every morning, and that is coffee. At the beginning of the 19th century, El Salvador's coffee industry was booming. At that time, El Salvador was under the control of the Spanish Empire, and the coffee industry accounted for 95% of its GDP. 77% of El Salvador's agricultural land was controlled by 1% of the people, causing from which the income index was very high in El Salvador. Only 14 families controlled Salvador, who built all the lodges solely for their own benefit. El Salvador became independent from Spanish rule in 1821, but for the next several years the same family ruled El Salvador. Then from the 1930s to the 1970s, El Salvador had a military dictatorship that introduced land reforms that benefited these 14 families were. And as a result, people started to hate the government, and this hatred grew so much that a fierce civil war between the government and the far left and far right political wings started, which lasted until 1992, and 65,000 people were killed in it. About 500,000 people left El Salvador and fled to various South American countries, and many people came here to the American city of Los Angeles, which at that time had already become the center point of the gang war. These gangs began targeting newly arrived El Salvadorans. In response, the people of El Salvador came together and formed their own community, which later became known as the MS-13 gang. This community, which was famous for protecting its family, had now become a group of hardened criminals who now started spreading crime in American cities as well. When the Civil War ended in 1992, the United Nations arrested the members of the group and started returning to El Salvador. After the Civil War, El Salvador's economy and institutions were completely destroyed, and these groups began to take advantage of this situation. Gang members who returned after being deported still had contact with criminals in the United States. And using them, these groups began to smuggle weapons from the United States into El Salvador, and through these weapons began to expand their influence in El Salvador. The groups forcibly received money from traders and shopkeepers, and anyone who refused or tried to report to the police would have been killed. Between 2000 and 2011, Salvador was completely controlled by gangs. The government was completely helpless, and a lot of fear had spread among the common people. The jails of El Salvador were filled with gang members, yet it made no difference. In fact, the situation was worsening. People were afraid to send their children to school due to the fear of abduction. The people of El Salvador were trying to go to America through legal and illegal means. Seeing the influx of so many groups, even the American administration was worried. To start a crackdown against these groups, the US government sent a message to the El Salvador government, but it seemed that even the government of El Salvador was afraid of these groups. In 2015, the government of El Salvador passed a law naming the groups as terrorist gangs and imposed sentences of up to 60 years for gang members on charges of ordinary crimes. But still, the crime rate did not change. The government also tried to negotiate with these groups, but all the measures failed. There was a lot of anger among the people against the government. In such a situation, in 2019, a young political activist on social media began to become quite popular among the people. His name was Nayib Bukele. Nayib was the mayor of the capital of El Salvador, San Salvador, and he openly talked about the deteriorating law and order situation in El Salvador. And he criticized the government for adopting a soft approach. According to him, the only way to reduce crime in El Salvador was for the government to adopt a zero-tolerance policy against the groups. People liked his point of view a lot, and as a result, Bukele got 53 votes and became the president of El Salvador in 2019. And this is where the story of change in El Salvador begins. Bukele started working on his project as soon as he came to power. Therefore, he introduced a bill in the Assembly to borrow $19 million from the United States, which was rejected by lawmakers. In response, the government forces attacked the Parliament building and threatened lawmakers. And finally, the Assembly approved the loan under public pressure. Bukele did two things with the help received from America. 1. He built a high-security jail for 40,000 prisoners on 410 acres. 2. He recruited 38,000 police and 24,000 military personnel for the formation of a joint force. This force carried out regular patrols in El Salvador's cities, conducted raids, arrested gangs, and sent them to the high-security jail on 410 acres. Pressure on the groups began, but there was no significant change in the crime rate. But then, in March 2022, a large-scale war broke out between the groups in which almost 100 people were killed in 3 days. Bukele quickly passed a bill in the Assembly for a special parliamentary member, which allowed government forces to arrest anyone for the next 30 days, search their homes, and also give them the right to shoot in some cases. No one could be prosecuted in any court for 30 days. In the next few months, 70,000 people were arrested. Those who resisted were shot dead. By the end of 2022, the murder rate in El Salvador had dropped by 56%, and in 2023, the crime rate in El Salvador decreased further compared to the United States. Today, the people of El Salvador are freely moving in markets and businesses. There is no one threatening shopkeepers or extorting money from them. And all credit goes to Nayib Bukele, whose approval rating has exceeded 90% in just 2 years. Many Latin American leaders are considering adopting policies similar to Nayib Bukele's to control crime rates. However, according to many analysts, El Salvador has paid a heavy price to reduce its crime rate, and the cost is that Bukele now holds undisputed power. The special executive law, which was approved for 30 days, he has been extended 22 times and is still in effect today. resulting in 2% of El Salvador's population being in jail and yet to face trial. According to local journalists, among those arrested are many innocent individuals whose families do not even know whether they are in jail or not. This is a Mejia whose daughter has been snatched by the forces for a year and a half, and to date, she has no idea which jail she is in. There are thousands of other cases that indicate this law has become a nightmare for many people. In January 2022, Bukele's forces raided the office of the prosecutor, investigating allegations of corruption against his government, intimidating them to the extent that 4 investigators fled El Salvador and all cases were suppressed. On one hand, there is no doubt that Bukele has performed a miracle for El Salvador as an alternative. But on the other hand, he has become so powerful in this process that his government is not accountable to the courts. However, perhaps all this was necessary for the attainment of peace. Only time will tell how this undeniable power of Bukele will prove beneficial for El Salvador in the future. In your opinion, what happened in El Salvador is the best way to overcome the crime rate, or was it a very crude point of view that could result in consequences in the coming days? Leave your impressions in the comments below, because we like to read your comments. These are all the means through which we have consulted for this video. If you like the video, then like and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next video. Allah Hafiz, take care of yourself.